We know what our goals are. We know what we hope to accomplish.
When I walked on Main Street for the first time, and I was kind of flabbergasted, I think.
Oh, hello there. So glad you could come along. I am the Dream Finder.
We're leaving Main Street Station right now, so wave it goodbye.
Welcome to the Main Street Chronicles. On this podcast, our historians will help lead you on a journey through Disney history, fantasy, and legend as they tell the told and untold stories of Disney.
Hey everybody, and welcome to this special episode of the Main Street Chronicles. I'm joined by Stokes and a special guest, Sam from Mama Bear Jamboree, and we're going to be talking to former Walt Disney Imagineer Alan Coats, who's the son of former legendary Imagineer Claude Coats, who we just covered in the latest episode of the Main Street Chronicles. How's everybody doing today? Stokes, what's going on, buddy?
Not too much. How are things there down the road?
Pretty good, pretty good. Sam, welcome for your first time ever to the Main Street Chronicles. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Glad to be here.
And last but not least, Alan, thank you so much for coming on to the show. How are you today, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Considering the circumstances of what's going on, I'm well, thanks.
Well, great. So we'd like for you to start the show off for us just by sharing some stories of your dad and his time at Walt Disney Imagineering, or at the time, WED Enterprises.
Well, that's a big question. How much time do we have, Brian?
As much time as you want, Alan. This is completely for you.
Well, I grew up at the Walt Disney Studio. I was a child. I mean, Disney has been part of my entire life, so I have so many stories to tell. But we're focusing on Claude Coats, the Imagineer. And let me just mention that word Imagineer didn't really come about until the early 60s during the World's Fair. When Dad began working on Disneyland, he wasn't called an Imagineer. He was an art director, a show designer, of whatever Walt needed him to do. That's what he was called. So I did so many different things for the company. I worked at Disneyland. I worked at the studio. I was in Florida. I was at WED. There wasn't a WDI when I was there. I guess we should start with Dad's very beginnings at Disneyland and how he began working there and what he did first and what Walt asked him to do to help get the park opened in time. Dad had just finished his work on Lady and the Tramp, doing the backgrounds on that film. And he was ready to move on. He had been doing animation work, backgrounds, color styling, and all of the Disney classic films since Snow White. It had been 20 years. And he was ready to use his architectural background, his sculptural background, his thinking dimensionally. He was ready to do this. And Walt came into his office. He was there with Ken Anderson. And he said, you know, guys, the scenic studio that's doing the flats, the scenic backgrounds for the Snow White dark ride, the Peter Pan dark ride, and Mr. Toad, well, they've told me they're not going to be able to finish Mr. Toad for opening day. They're too busy. So he points to Dad and he points to Ken Anderson and he says, you guys do it. And he turns around and he walks out. So that began what Dad calls his second Disney career. His first career was two-dimensional in animation. His second career was three-dimensional in what became Imagineering. Claude and Ken Anderson had to figure out, how are we going to go from working in 12-inch field animation to 18-foot high flats that are environmental, that are three-dimensional? And they had to figure out how to do this fast to get Mr. Toad ready to open July 17th, 1955. And they did it. Dad said, I had to learn a lot in a real big hurry. And he did. And from there went on to, went right over to Tomorrowland to finish a project called Space Station X1, which was the first satellite view of America, that no one really knew what that was, but Claude and Peter Ellenshaw were down on their hands and knees painting this huge scenic globe of North America. That became one of the few attractions that opened in Tomorrowland on opening day, July 17th. But that's how he got his start. Walt just said, Claude, do it. No one really even knew exactly what Walt's dream was. There was no such thing as a theme park. And they really didn't know exactly how this was going to work out. Everyone was just doing this just to get it finished. And they weren't sure exactly what it was going to become. It was called Disney's Folly by many people outside the company, just like that's what they said about Snow White. But Walt was usually right, and he sure was in this case. So he had an instant hit on his hands.
It's actually funny that you shared that story first, because that's actually the first story that we put in the show. Nice to know that the stuff that we actually reported on was factual. So that's some credibility there. So thanks.
Well, my father was the right man in the right place at the right time. As I said, he was ready to move from animation into three-dimensional environments, and that's exactly what he was good at doing. He used to say Walt was a great casting director. He seemed to know what their abilities were, even if they didn't know themselves. And my father had no experience in painting with blacklight fluorescent paint, working in an ultraviolet environment. The three dark rides in Fantasyland, Snow White, Peter Pan, and Mr. Toad, this was a new way to work. He had never painted this way before. And so he was making it up as he went, so to speak, trying to figure out how to make things work. And later when he worked with Yale Gracie, the great man of illusions, on the Haunted Mansion, they had to figure out, how are we going to do this illusion as simple as possible, as cost effectively as possible, and get it finished on time? So there was always pressure to make these illusions happen. And often they were very simple. People thought they were more complicated and more technical than they really were. They were actually often very simple visual elements that made things work. Particularly in the dark rides, you were moving so quickly, you didn't have a lot of time to see things, so they could make things, go by. There wasn't a lot of detail necessary. But painting in ultraviolet light added dimension. Dad said things just seemed to have more perspective and depth using that type of paint in that kind of lighting than if regular incandescent light had been used. You would have lost all of the effect. Now in the Pirates of the Caribbean, which was such a huge environment, that big space, that was totally different. That was lit with incandescent lights, with theatrical type lighting, with floodlights and spotlights. The first time Dad took me to Disneyland was before it opened. I saw it and he showed me the park in construction. And that was really exciting to see it that way. And Walt was there, and it was a special day for the families. It was 2 weeks before the opening, and Walt invited the families from the studio to bring their kids down. And he wanted to see how people would react to his dream place that he had never really seen being enjoyed yet by groups of people. And I was one of the fortunate kids to be there to see as much as I could. Only half the park was functioning. Frontierland and Jungle Cruise, they were operating, and we got into one of the jungle boats, and Walt got in. Walt got right in the boat. He didn't give us the tour through the jungle. He was too busy running around and doing other things. But he was so nice. He said, "Welcome, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy Disneyland and have a good time." And we sure did. It was a great day. And then we came back 2 weeks later for opening day too. So I have the perspective, I guess, at my age now of looking back and seeing the way things were and how it began. And I'm trying to focus now on my mind about the beginnings. I told you how Dad got his start. Walt just said, "Do it," and Dad did it. So it was that abrupt and that simple and that important. He just took the job and went with it.
A follow-up question for you there about the original dark rides, specifically Mr. Toad and Alice in Wonderland. Were they painted on flat surfaces, the characters painted on flat surfaces to, in a sense, to bring out the talents of your dad and Ken Anderson since they were painters? Or was it also potentially a reason to get the attractions done? Like, why were animatronics not used in those attractions versus the flats? Any idea?
Yes, I have an idea. All of those early 3 dark rides, the flats, the backings were plywood. They were very quickly put up, very simple, very cost effective. And that's what they were painting on. They made dimension because they were such good artists. Claude and Ken and the other people working on these shows created dimension, the way they painted it and the way it was lit. And there weren't any audio animatronics in those days. There was very little character movement. The barrels that teetered and almost fell on you, for instance, in the Mr. Toad ride, and the locomotive coming at you from the tunnel, that was about the major bit of animation. And the little devil characters dancing around at the end, but that was very simple. I mean, there wasn't a lot of detailed animation in those rides, really.
Was Peter Pan and Snow White the same way as well on opening day?
All 3 were that way on opening day.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
So why do you think, and this is completely your opinion, why do you think Peter Pan got audio animatronics or figures versus flats now and the other ones haven't been upgraded?
Well, I was on opening day, I said everything was pretty simple. Peter Pan really was the same way. It had the dimensional pirate ship. You were looking down on the model of London. It was really pretty basic and very simple. There wasn't a lot of animation. That came later when Fantasyland had an entire redo. It was totally recreated, as you know, in 1983. That brought dimension into the dark rides. Dad's original version of Alice in Wonderland was completely changed to be more dimensional with full figures and animation. That was not the case in 1958 when the first Alice ride opened. But the first 3 blacklight rides were painted against flat scenic plywood. The characters too, many of them, were just painted that way to look dimensional because these guys were so good at what they did. They had worked on the films. They knew how to make the rides look like animation come to life. Also, Claude and Ken Anderson, as you know, I'm sure, painted the murals, the facings behind the load area. So as guests were standing in the queue line, they got a little bit of an idea about what they were going to see. They said, oh yes, I remember that film. Those are the characters, those are the incidents. That's a train chasing Mr. Toad in the car. And then you got into the ride and there you were in the film that people remembered. So those murals on the facings of each attraction were very important. They not only were interesting, but they gave you a pre-show, so to speak, of what you were going to see inside these little rides, which were small and they only lasted, a minute and a half. We're talking about very seat of the pants Imagineering, if you want to use that word now. It was just, let's make this up as we go and get it opened. And people are going to love it, and they did. So that's the way it happened. Quickly and effectively and magically, it just happened.
And you brought up the murals that they did for those 2 attractions. We actually, and I know they've since been redone, but we found pictures of the originals and we actually are using the originals as social media posts later on this month. So we've got a artist table and every day we will have a different background of your dad's work showcasing some of the backgrounds that he did to highlight that first story that we talked about.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad you have those original murals.
It took a lot longer than I thought. We kept finding the new ones and I'm like, this is wrong. Like there was actually an article that said that it was your dad's, and then I zoomed in and it was a different signature at the bottom, and I was like, that's not his signature.
Yeah.
It's like somebody didn't check their sources there. But the next topic that we cover is your dad's involvement with the Haunted Mansion, and we go very deep into this and talk about, because last month we talked about Mark Davis, so we thought it was fitting that we share the entire story of the Haunted Mansion, of how they both had two different perspectives. What can you tell us from your recollection of his involvement with the Haunted Mansion, and did he enjoy the outcome?
Dad did enjoy the outcome. He thought it considering the way it was put together without Walt, and he mentioned that in a quote that I put on his website, that as we know, this was the first major attraction that was done without Walt's presence and final approval. And so everyone was concerned about, okay, how would Walt have done it? But they were experienced enough. They had all worked with Walt for enough time to understand, I think this is the way he would have wanted to do it. I think this is fine. He put Mark and Claude together as the basic show designers of the Pirates of the Caribbean, and look how great that came out. So he was able to make people work together somehow, and what came out of it was just, was fantastic. He took me through the Haunted Mansion again before it was finished, when the lights were on, so I got to see how all this magic was created, and this was really great that he could do this. He could take me through, and I could get to see how things were going to happen before the lights went out, and it was done as we see it today. I think the stories about the conflict, the tension between Claude and Mark, I think that's overplayed a little bit. It's because, as you can see, the mansion is really almost like a 3-act play. The beginning is Claude's work, and he wanted it to be scary. It's a haunted mansion. That's what people expect. So it is kind of dark and moody, and you feel like something is maybe going to happen here. The result of fear is that you experience it, but at the end you're glad you came through it okay, which you do. And the end of the ride is more humorous. Big party going on in the graveyard. That's Mark Davis, of course, and everyone's having a good time. So you survived, and you prevailed, and you had a good time. And the little figure is saying, come back and see us again, and don't forget your death certificate. But Dad told me, yeah, I think it works. I think it worked beautifully, because it was a lot of people having to work together to make it come to be what it was. And I think it worked fine. So did Dad.
It's interesting that you say that it was overplayed, and I'm glad that you've got this on the record now, because we took the story verbatim from actually a Disney book. Fantastic book, but plays up that, hey, it was not a good time, that they were fighting for, almost as if it was as egos battling. And so I'm glad that we have you on here to be able to set the record straight, that it wasn't as bad as everyone plays it up to be.
No, it wasn't. And I've been told that by other Disney historians as well, that's a little bit overplayed. It makes for dramatic text. If you want to talk about, the big thing that was going on between these two guys, it really wasn't like that. They knew they had to work together to make this come to be. And there was the input of so many other people. There was Rolly Crump, and there was Exitensio, and there was Buddy Baker doing the music, and there was all these other folks, coming involved, in Yale Gracie with all these illusions. I mean, other people had so much input. It wasn't just Mark and Claude. They may have been project show designers, but all these other people had input. John Hinch, of course, all these people would be there. So there was a family group there. They all said, okay, we don't have Walt, but we've all worked with him for so many years. And look what we did with the Pirates. We can do it again. And they did. So I think, as I said, Dad was totally pleased with the way it came out. And I think maybe looking at the fan base that I've talked to, going to the 50th anniversary celebrations in August of 19, it was just, the people just, they live their lives. They just think it's the greatest attraction there. So I think it just came through wonderfully. It just came through great.
How was the 50th anniversary? Since we're East Coasters, we of course couldn't make it out there.
Well, it was huge. I was there for part of it. I didn't stay all night long, as some people did, and stand in long lines to ride the attractions, dress up as their favorite characters from the mansion. I went to one of the dinner events and I made a presentation, and I spoke on behalf of Claude, and I was there with Yale Gracie's son, who brought the skeleton head of the Hatbox Ghost that his father saved and gave to him. And that was, people just went crazy when they saw that. So
I don't know if you saw our eyes, but we just all lit up.
we brought artifacts from the mansion, and it was a wonderful time, and so much love of that attraction. That would have been, it opened in August of '69, so it was the big 50th anniversary. It was huge. The Disney company loves anniversaries, so, and they went all out on this one, and it was a lot of fun. It was just, people were just in love with that attraction. The ones that I have talked to, some of them, their houses, they live in haunted mansions. They wear those clothes. They wear the makeup. It gets pretty intense, but some people are very much into that attraction, maybe more than anything else at Disneyland. That it really affects people, the way they live their lives, and hopefully it's a good way.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a website, I think it's still active, Doom Buggies. I think that's been around for 15 or 20 years now. And just like you said, I mean, people take the Haunted Mansion as a way of life. And how does that make you feel, since your dad helped create that attraction? I mean, obviously we all love it and we all know it's a classic, but coming from somebody who has a personal relationship with this attraction, how does that feel, knowing that so many people fell in love with something that your dad created 50 years ago?
It makes me feel good. Of course, it validates what they did, that it did work, even though Walt wasn't there saying, yes, this is fine. They got it right, and I think they all knew they did. And remember, the mansion went on to other parks as well. I helped do the installation and some of the creation on the Haunted Mansion in Florida at the Magic Kingdom. But it's also in Tokyo. It's also in different versions in Paris and in other parks too. So that's the thing. These adventures go on around the world, and so they become worldwide phenomenons. It's not just Disneyland. These attractions are so strong and so incredible and so creatively satisfying that they're able to be used in other cultures, and people enjoy them in other countries. They enjoy them all over the world.
So it's also funny that you mentioned that, because I've written down, you've mentioned 4 attractions so far: Peter Pan, Snow White, Haunted Mansion, and Mr. Toad. And at least at Disneyland, those attractions have stood the test of time since the first few years all the way up to present day. Why do you think that is? Is it Walt's influence or the strength of those early Imagineers that are working on them?
Well, obviously the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion are just, they're the quintessential theme park attractions. The Pirates in Shanghai is just so much more digitized and much more 21st century and much more technologically polished. But when you go back and see the original Pirates or the original Mansion, there's almost a quaintness about them, I guess you might say. And I think that's why one generation brings the next back. The parents want the kids to see it because they remember it as a kid. And I think there's something in those rides that just touches people. That's always going to do that. It's some kind of a magical touch that Walt had, and he passed it on to the other Imagineers. I can't really explain what that is, but somehow it seemed to work on the ones you mentioned. But many of Claude's attractions no longer exist. They're changed for whatever reason, or they're completely gone. And Walt said, Disneyland will always be changing. It will never be a static thing. It'll always be growing and changing and getting better. And Dad understood that. If something has to be changed or eliminated, fine, because we'll go on and we'll do something better the next time, something improved, something more special, more magical.
So what do you think that your dad would say if he were to see the parks today?
Well, Dad would have his opinions about things. He was a pretty open, easygoing guy, and I think he would say, "Yeah, sure, that's fine. That works." Walt would never put anything down. He was a very positive person, and so was Dad. Walt would never say, "Oh, that's terrible. That's a lousy idea. Don't waste my time." He would never do that. What Walt would say is, "Well, what if we did it this way?" He wouldn't say, "No, I don't like it," but he'd kind of say in a positive way, "Well, let's work on this some more. Give me some more ideas." Everyone's trying to please Walt and trying to do their best. That's why they're there. And Walt never gave compliments, you know that too. He never said, "Boy, that's a great job." He'd never say that. He didn't need to, because these guys and gals were creating great things for him. He didn't need to thank each one of them or shake their hands. I think they knew he approved. But to answer your question about Dad, I don't think he ever said, "Yeah, boy, that's a real stinker. I can't believe we ever did that." He never said that. He was always positive. Nothing was perfect. It's like a film or a book or a painting. You always want to go back and tweak it and fix it and do that. But Walt was always thinking ahead, and Dad had to do that too, and all the Imagineers did. We have to keep moving and improving. If something doesn't work, we make it work the next time. And if people are getting bored standing in line, we entertain them. We bring in a band. We do a longer pre-show. We do something to keep them entertained all the time, so they're getting their money's worth. So it was working with the guests too and reading them. Walt liked to go out into the park when people were there, but the problem was he'd be mobbed for autographs. So he really, on a heavy attendance day, if he had to go through the park, he'd walk very fast with his head down, because he just didn't want to be stopped. He couldn't do that, or he'd never get anything done. So once he walked right past my mother and I, and she said, "Oh, Walt," and he stopped just for a minute, and then he kept walking. I said, "That's fine. He can't stop. He can't take the time." I would like to have talked to him and said hello, but it didn't happen that day. It happened on other times. But
what was your dad's brainstorming process like once he started a new project?
Well, it would depend on a couple of things. Like I said, if Walt said, like for Mr. Toad, "Claude, you do this. You're going to do it." Okay, fine. Then Claude said, "Yeah." If Walt was less specific, like, work up some ideas, Claude. Let's do something about, pirates, something about swashbuckling. Walt would have these things in his head, but he didn't know. That's why he had all these creative people around him. He said, "Give me some ideas." I guess that's the brainstorming thing that happened at WED. Before it was WDI, we're talking about WED in the 50s and the 60s. And Walt would say, just, "Give me some ideas." He didn't know exactly what he wanted. That's why he had Claude and Mark and John and all these people, Marty, all these people around him. Let's come up with something here. And Walt would never say, "Come up to my office." He'd always come to your office. He'd just poke his head in and say, "What you got, Claude?" And Claude was ready. He'd have a little model. He'd have sketches, a storyboard. He'd be ready, and he'd say, "Okay, Walt, this is what I got. What do you think? Let's take a look at this." And he could read what he wanted. And once he got a little loud, he said, "Claude, are you sure there are wild turkeys in the Grand Canyon?" Because he was working on the Grand Canyon diorama, and Walt said, "There aren't any wild turkeys in the Grand Canyon." "Yes, there are, Walt. You sent me down there. I've talked to the naturalists. I've been there." "You sure?" "Yes, Walt. I'm sure." Okay. And that story goes on further too. But there were group sessions, of course, where people would all get together and brainstorm about ideas. There'd be storyboards there, there'd be models, always models, because you had to see the spatial area you were working in, because you were going to be in 3 dimensions anyway. A fancy rendering didn't, Dad didn't do a lot of paintings or renderings because they really didn't give you the spatial necessary feel that you were going to have anyway at the attraction when you were riding through it. You needed to see the space. And so that's what was always in the meeting, in the middle of the table. And there were plans and all the other stuff too. And people came up with their ideas and their suggestions. And once again, don't say no. It's always yes, if. That's what he said to Walt. Yes, if. Never no, but. And people would go back to their offices and they'd have more meetings. Finally, there got to be too many meetings. I think Dad got a little tired at the end of all of the meetings, and the accountants coming in and the bean, what do they call them? The bean counters?
Absolutely.
And one of them once said, Claude, you're going to have to move your track. We have a beam holding up the ceiling here. And Dad said, I'm not moving my track. People are paying to see this show. You get that beam moved. That's one time that he got a little upset with somebody. And Mark once said to Walt, Walt, this is going to cost a lot of money. I don't know. And Walt said, Mark, we got Roy up there to take care of the costs. What we have to do is make the best show we can make, and the people will pay us back. That's what Walt said. Of course, he was right.
So the third artifact that we're discussing in the show is a full-size brontosaurus, and we used that to tie in the 1964 World's Fair. We used it to tie in Primeval World, and then finally, Universe of Energy. You were telling us before that you have another story that can tie dinosaurs with your dad. I would love to hear what that story is.
With the success of Disneyland, Walt had so many ideas going. It was just, he had Dad and his art directors, as they were called, or show designers, working on so many projects. One of the things Dad was working on was something called Adventures in Science. Walt wanted to expand Tomorrowland almost immediately. And in 56, 57, Dad was working on this project called Adventures in Science, and one of the shows in there was The Age of Reptiles. It was going to be a time travel show that went from the primeval world to the planets, outer space adventure. It was going to be in a revolving theater that Dad had come up with. And that theater later became the theater they used in the GE Carousel of Progress. So the point is, there were so many ideas early on that didn't get used at that time, but they resurfaced later. And Dad's work on dinosaurs actually began in this first show that they were talking to General Motors about sponsoring. I think Walt was thinking ahead at Epcot already. And so Dad was doing this dinosaur show. They were also working on a microscopic world show, which later became Adventures Through Inner Space. So there are no bad ideas. I never threw anything away. I don't think Dad did either. You keep them and you go back to them and you say, oh, remember that show we worked on? And right up until the opening of the Grand Canyon, Dad wasn't sure what Walt wanted to do. I was a teenager. I was rooting for the reptiles. I wanted him to do the dinosaur show. And Dad came home one night. This would have been 57, late 57. He said, well, it looks like it's going to be the Grand Canyon. So Walt decided wisely to put the Grand Canyon diorama on the railroad line because there wasn't anything to see from the train between the Tomorrowland station and Main Street. They did the Grand Canyon diorama instead of the dinosaur show, but the dinosaurs came back in the Ford Pavilion for the World's Fair. So it's recycling ideas. That's what Wed and Dad and the other Imagineers and Walt were so great at doing, is always remembering and keeping your ideas, because you're going to use them again. There are no bad ideas. And that's why Walt didn't put anything down, because, you know, we're just going to use this again later. And Bob Gurr will tell you the same thing, that they'll go back and say, that show that Claude did, remember that show that didn't happen? Let's go back and get the plans out for that. And it's already been done. Let's reuse it. I will mention briefly an interesting chapter that's going to be in the Claude Coats book that's being written now. Dad did a list called Never Never Lands. He did this starting in the 50s, and he kept a record of all of the attractions he worked on that never happened. But pieces of them did appear. They did finally come up in other forms, in other shows down the line. So I have a list here that you'll be seeing in the book of, you know, 2 or 3 dozen really interesting shows that most of them didn't happen in that original form, but pieces of them were used later, as I said. So this is a very interesting document that I found in Dad's studio.
Well, that's something to look forward to when the book comes out. You've already talked about how Walt told your dad and many others who were working at the studio this is what you're going to do. I'm going to put you in this place to succeed. I'm going to put you in this position because I need you to do this. What inspired him while he was an Imagineer?
He loved what he was doing so much. As I said, he was using the talents that he had from his background in architecture, his background in furniture making and model making. He'd often be the first person to arrive in the morning and wait in the middle of Flower Street in Glendale until the guard opened the gate and he could drive in, and he'd rush in because he had an idea in his head. And he'd make a very quick sketch, but he'd always build a little model first, maybe a 1/4-inch model out of paper, just to get an idea of the spatial quality that he needed to tell the story, to make it work with the ride system that was going to be used. He had these processes in his head of how to work. And a really good Imagineer is someone who starts with the concept and goes all the way through with his hard hat on to construction, to installation, to pre-operations, to standing there listening to the guests coming out, going back and tweaking and fixing things. So Dad was one of the total Imagineers that did, I can't say he did everything. No one did everything. He saw a project through from beginning to the end. It may have been his concept. Usually it was Walt's concept that people were working on, because Walt had the ideas of what he wanted to have for people to see at the park. And people did that until he was gone. But he left a lot of things to pick up from. But let me get back to Dad. What inspired him? Part of it was the people he was working with. He was a team player. He loved to be in the model shop. He spent as much time in the model shop as he did in his office. And he loved people, and he became a mentor for many younger Imagineers, and he loved to talk to people. If someone poked their head in his office, he'd put everything down and say, "Hey, come on in. Let me show you what I'm working on. Let me show you what I'm doing." And he was open to everybody. And I think he enjoyed the process of what he was doing, helping other people do what they needed if they wanted his help, and they usually asked for it. And he would be right there getting his hands dirty, making the models with the model makers, and they wanted his help. He wouldn't just say, "Do this, I'll come back in an hour and look at it." No, he'd say, let me work with you. Is that okay? They'd say, "Sure, Claude." And he'd get right down there and work with them and build the models. He built a lot of models himself. So I think it was just the interaction and his vision of being able to see how it was going to come together, because he was the project show designer. He had to know what the final result was going to be. And if things started to go a little off track, he had to be sure that, it was going in the right direction. Not only the imagination, but the engineering, Imagineering, the two had to work together. For instance, the Omnimover was probably the greatest ride system because it was like a director moving a movie camera. That Omnimover, Dad could point wherever he wanted it to point. So the guest had to look, if you were in the mansion or in inner space, or if you had wings or one of the shows that used that ride system, it was like, this is what I want you to see. And so it was a controlled system. That's why that particular ride system was so effective. So Dad had to just think of all of these things to make it work. And each day was an adventure. He couldn't wait to get to work, but he'd leave usually at a regular hour. Walt would stop working about 5 o'clock, take a break, have his scotch mist, and just think about the day and what was going to happen tomorrow. And I think Dad would do that too. I tend to overload myself and then I lose focus. I don't think Dad ever lost focus. I think he kept the focus, kept the crews going and the team going, and just talked to everybody and was, open to everything. So I think people love my father. I think they just thought he was the greatest guy to work for. The only thing you had to do is walk fast. His dad was 6'6", and if you were at Disneyland with Dad, you had to do 2 steps for every one he did.
That's funny because that's how it is when Stokes and I go, because we're both over 6 feet ourselves, and anybody that goes with us is taking 2 steps to R1.
So what do you think he would consider his proudest moment working as an Imagineer?
I was thinking about that. Probably the day of the public opening of Pirates of the Caribbean, and he was at the exit and hearing people come out, and I'm sure everyone was just so excited and happy and thrilled about that attraction, as I was. When the first time I saw it completely finished, I just was blown away. I thought it was just incredible, and I think that's the reaction that he got, and the satisfaction from all those that had been in the works on and off for years, and to finally see it being presented to happy people coming out and enjoying the work, that must have been the greatest moment of satisfaction he could have had. That was his favorite attraction. He told me, he said, yeah, the Pirates is my favorite, the most satisfying thing I ever did. And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was his favorite animated film that he did, the very first feature. He said, yeah, that was really the one that I am most proud of my work on. So
he did an amazing job with the backgrounds in Snow White that I could see why that would be his favorite.
And it's really special being able to hear about the things that were his favorites when he worked on so many different things. So taking it to the opposite end, what would you say was his hardest moment as an Imagineer?
Well, the only time he came back from a meeting once, I happened to be at the house, and he came home and he said, it was a terrible meeting, had an awful meeting, terrible meeting. He was really upset about something that had happened there, but that was very unusual. He had to be a positive person and keep going. And I think he rolled with the punches and had to just, stay positive and keep working and keep thinking ahead. I can't think of any project that didn't happen that that was so upsetting to him. It was pretty easygoing. And I can't really think of anything that was, to him, a total bummer that happened at WED. I never saw anything like that with him. Maybe some other people you talk to, if they happen to mention something, maybe they will, but I can't think of anything that was really disappointing to him, or he said, gee, I wish I could have done that again. It just didn't work at all. He never said that. Maybe it was too positive. I mean, you can be, as far as I can tell you guys, he didn't have any real unpleasant moments that I'm aware of. Everything seemed to go, he had a pretty charmed life, I guess.
I think the optimism that he had helped with that.
Yes, yeah. And Walt passed that on. I think they were close. I think Walt was an amazing person, just such an open, optimistic guy. And people would pick up on that. And they wanted to make him happy. Someone once asked Dad, how was it to work with Walt? And he said, it was very easy to work with Walt, as long as you gave him exactly what he wanted. So Dad could read Walt, and he knew what he needed to give him, and that's what he did. And that's what he said. Give him exactly what he wants, and you've done your job. I will tell you one sad story, though, and it's how close he was with Walt. They were in what later became the Disney Gallery above the Pirate Ride. It's now the Princess Suite, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
He was up there with Walt, and this is at the end of Walt's life. It was just before he died, and they were doing testing of the Pirate Ride, which was going to open, the Pirates, it was going to open about in a couple of months, about 3 months later. Walt really wanted to see the Pirate Ride, and he said, Claude, I can't make it down there. You go for me. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, can you imagine being asked by Walt Disney to be his eyes and ears and tell him what he would have seen but wasn't able to go personally. So Dad, this is what Dad told me. So he went down and looked at the Pirate Ride, I guess the way he thought Walt would look at it. And he went back up to this sick man and said, Walt, you would have been satisfied. I think you would have been pleased that we did the best job we could do. I think that satisfied Walt. I hope it did. It's a sad story. And then Walt died in December of 66, and then the Pirates opened, in March of 67. So it's too bad that he didn't get to see it completed. But he saw it through Claude's eyes. Dad did the best job he could do to try to help Walt through a very difficult time.
That's really special. Thanks for sharing that. Alan, thanks so much for coming on. Now, a little birdie has told me that you're working on a project that we would like to share with our listeners. So tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on.
I am working on a book on the career of my father, Claude Coats. And this book has been in the works for a couple of years because books take a while to get done. Dad has been in many, many books, of course, and on in websites and just call him up on the internet. People know who he is and what he's done, particularly fans of Dad. But this book is going to cover specifically the making of Disneyland, the 15 years that he helped Walt create Disneyland. The book is called, the working title now is Walt Disney's Imagineer, Claude Coats, The Making of Disneyland, from Toad Hall to the Haunted Mansion and beyond. And it is in pre-sales. Brian, if you have the bit.ly site that people can call up, they can go right to, they can go right online and pick up a pre-sale copy of the book. It will be ready by the middle of 2021. We're looking at the 50th anniversary celebration of Walt Disney World, and we want to tie in with that. But the book is focusing primarily on that period of the creation of Disneyland. My father's career was 54 and a half years, so that would take several books to cover the animation and all of the Imagineering he did. Let me talk about the author. The book is being written by Dave Bossert, who was one of the major authors and historians of Disney history. He's written many books, and I am so delighted to be working with this creative, wonderful writer. I will write the introduction to the book. Tony Baxter is going to write the foreword to the book. And we are interviewing many people. We're getting stories, images, photographs, documents that have not been published before. This book is really going to be something special. We're really excited about it. And Dave and I are really working hard to get this finished and ready for its printing and its release next year by the middle, we hope, of 2021, summer 2021. So check out the book, do your pre-sale, and you're going to love this book. It's really going to be a great volume you're going to want to have in your Disney collection.
I know we're excited about it, and you can check out our social media pages to get the link for that. Make sure that you check it out and get your pre-sale copy, so that way you don't miss out on this amazing book. Alan, thank you so much for coming on the Main Street Chronicles and sharing your dad's story. We're really excited to get these out to our listeners, and we can't wait to have you back on the show.
I really appreciate you talking to me and focusing on my father, and this has been wonderful. And thank you very much, you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Main Street Chronicles, part of the Imagination Radio Network and a BRS production.